The final lecture of our marine ecology curriculum is about pollution and climate change. For this starter slide, I'm showing a picture from a terrible oil spill that occurred in Alaska in 1989. Oil tanker captain was driving drunk and ran aground on a rocky reef, spilling a very large amount of oil into the sensitive fjord estuary of Prince William Sound, Alaska. So many animals were covered in oil or affected by the toxins in the oil, and it was a really huge disaster that the nation felt deeply. One of the tragic things about this disaster is that some of the cleanup efforts may have done more harm than good, and that's what we see happening in this picture. This is a beach covered in oil, and hot water hoses are being used to blast the oil off the beach. The thing is that any life that has not been directly killed by the oil is then killed by the hot water blasts. Some subsequent studies found that beaches that had not been cleaned in this way actually had more life in the months and years following the oil spill than beaches that were basically sterilized in this manner. So in more recent oil spills, we've had some of the same types of controversy where sometimes the cleanup method can be as harmful or more so than the spill itself. So obviously prevention is the best way to avoid these harmful impacts of an oil spill. Alright, so before we get too deep into the details, let's do the basic work of defining what pollution is. A pollutant is something that humans put into the environment that causes adverse effects. So any material that we put into the environment that causes adverse effects, and adverse effects are any kinds of harm. So it could be harm to marine organisms, like you see this old fishing net that has gotten snagged around the neck of the seal here, so that's obviously harming that marine organism. The harm could be a hazard to human health. If there's a toxic chemical in the environment that is poisoning humans when they're swimming or eating seafood, that would be a hazard to human health. The harm could be hindrance of human activities. Maybe it's not hurting you, but it's preventing you from doing the things that you like to do, like go swimming or fishing. And pollution can reduce ecosystem goods and services. So we talked a little bit in the biodiversity lecture about how biodiverse ecosystems are more able to provide beneficial functions like primary and secondary productivity, habitat stabilization, and things like that. So basically a polluted ecosystem may not be able to do the things that a healthy ecosystem would be able to do, and that means that a polluted ecosystem may not be as valuable either to wildlife or to humans. Marine pollution is found throughout the ocean, but there are certain areas where it tends to concentrate due to density effects. So some types of pollutants collect in the surface of the ocean, in the neuston layer, along with the living components of the neuston. Some types of pollutants sink to the bottom and accumulate in the sediments, and they may sink themselves, or they may adhere to particles, and then the particles sink and they end up on the bottom. And then where there are density transition layers in the midwaters, like picnic lines, pollutants can collect in those areas as well. And pollutants also tend to be more concentrated near their sources, as one might expect, and they can be more concentrated along beaches and coasts where they're deposited by winds and currents. There are two basic categories of pollution. There are things that are found naturally in the environment at some amount and yet can be pollutants when they're in excess. And then there are things that should not be in the environment at all because they're entirely man-made. And the names for the two different categories of pollutants are quantitative pollutants. Those are the ones that can occur naturally, but if they're in unnaturally large amounts, they're bad. And qualitative pollutants, which are totally man-made substances that you would never find naturally in nature. So some examples of quantitative pollutants would be hydrocarbons like oil and methane. They do occur naturally in the environment. There are places where small amounts seep out of the sediments, for example. but if there's a big oil spill, then it's an unnaturally large amount due to humans, and we consider that pollutant. Nutrients, which are essential in the environment and an important part of natural cycles, can nevertheless be pollutants if they're present in an excessive amount that begins to have adverse effects like causing algae blooms. Heavy metals like mercury are found naturally in the environment, but the concentrations have greatly increased due to certain human activities to the point that they're harmful now. And even fresh water, which we think is as the purest thing ever, can be a pollutant in an estuary or marine environment if there's an unnaturally large amount of fresh water due to human activities, such as water diversions from one area to another area that didn't normally receive so much fresh water. And so fresh water itself can actually be a pollutant, making the environment unsuitable for marine organisms. And then some examples of qualitative pollutants would be things like plastic, which never existed in the ocean before humans, and halogenated hydrocarbons, these synthetic chemicals created in labs that would also never have been found in nature before humans. Let's talk about one of the quantitative pollutants first, hydrocarbon pollution. So hydrocarbon pollution, the most common or most famous kind is oil, like from oil spills, which can be big dramatic events like the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico or the Exxon Valdez tanker disaster in Alaska, but they can also be sort of small leaks and runoff of oil from city areas. And if you tally up all the sources of oil pollution quantitatively, the little spills actually contribute more oil pollution than the few really infamous oil spills, but there's a different type of harm from the many little bits of oil getting into the ocean versus huge releases in one place. So the ways that oil harms marine life are directly by physically smothering and immobilizing organisms, as you can see happening to this pelican here that's covered in oil. It'll no longer be able to fly or insulate itself when its feathers are covered in oil, and so it'll die if it's not rescued and cleaned. And then there are some toxic effects of oil, because oil is not just one chemical, it's a mix of many, many different hydrocarbons, which are complex organic molecules with carbon and hydrogens forming chains and rings. And some of the components, some types of hydrocarbons are toxic to life. So some types that we call volatile organic compounds like benzene, we call them volatile because they can vaporize into the atmosphere, and we can be exposed to them that way from the fumes of an oil spill, if you will. Those can be harmful to life. And polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are hydrocarbons with multiple rings with double bonds in them. Many of those are toxic to life. And when you have an oil spill, both the physical harmful effects and the chemical harmful effects tend to be worse if the spill is near shore. Why is that? It's because, as you've learned earlier in this course, there's more life near shore than in the open ocean. So because there's more life there, there's more life in harm's way if the spill is near the coastline. And if you'd like to see a video about a recent terrible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that had ripple effects that are still found in some places today, check out the video link about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. When oil spills, it is transformed over time through the various physical and chemical processes in the environment that act on that spilled oil. And we call that sort of changes over time to the oil spill weathering. It's sort of like weather is acting on the oil spill and changing it. So this diagram shows a lot of the different weathering processes. One of the first things that happens is the oil spreads out over the water, and then the oil can mix partially with the water in a process called emulsification. Oil and water don't mix very well, but little droplets of oil do form and sort of integrate with the water in a process called emulsification. Some of the smaller molecules that are in the oil can evaporate into the atmosphere. It doesn't mean that they're gone or harmless, but they've sort of become a different type of pollution. Some components of the oil can dissolve in the water, and some of the oil, especially when it's emulsified and mixed with the water, can sink to the bottom and cause harm to life on the bottom. The only sort of positive thing that happens in the weathering process is biodegradation. That's where microbes break down the oil and they can turn it into less harmful forms. So these different weathering processes happen at different times. So the very first thing that happens, as I mentioned, is the spreading, evaporation, the dispersion, then emulsification and dissolution happen after that. But the things that take a longer time to happen would be the oxidation, sedimentation, and biodegradation. So those would be the things that are happening long after the spill that are sort of slowly taking care of the spill and transforming it into less harmful forms. Humans do various things to try to mitigate the impacts of oil spills or clean them up. If they can catch the oil spill early when it still has a thick slick on the surface, they can contain the spill, at least partially, with booms, which are sort of like giant floating pool noodles that corral the oil and keep it from drifting away into further area. When the oil is corralled, they will sometimes actually set it on fire, which seems strange and scary, but burning the oil, although it creates a lot of oil pollution, it's considered better for the environment than leaving that oil unburned, drifting and dispersing through the ocean. Another thing that we do to sort of break up oil slicks is this stuff called chemical dispersants, which is sort of like really strong soaps or detergents that break up the oil. The thing is, the chemical dispersants can include toxic chemicals, and they don't completely make the oil go away. They just break it up into smaller molecules and small particles that remain mixed in the water and can continue to cause harm. So the chemical dispersants may reduce the appearance of an oil slick and may prevent some organisms from being physically smothered in the oil, but they don't necessarily really eliminate the oil. One of the sort of more sustainable ways of dealing with an oil spill is by bioremediation, which means we're trying to accelerate the natural decomposition of the oil by microbes that can break down the hydrocarbons in the oil. And so we'll do that by sprinkling an inoculum of those oil-eating microbes onto the spill, or by putting some sort of substrates out in the environment that can help the naturally occurring microbes to break the oil down faster. All right, let's talk about another type of pollution, your classic pollution coming out of a pipe type of pollution. So this is what we call municipal and industrial effluent. Municipal means like from a city, and industrial means from a factory. So there's a lot of activities in residential and industrial areas that create polluted water that then ends up being discharged into the environment. When the pollution is coming out of a pipe or a dump site or a ditch, somewhere where you can point to the particular source of pollution, they call it point source pollution. And sewage is a really common type of point source pollution. And industrial wastewater would be another type of point source pollution. There's a different type, not every sort of thing that comes out of a pipe from a city is sewage, though. There's an important distinction between sewage and stormwater. So stormwater is where rain runoff is collected in ditches and drains and then flows through a pipe into the ocean. And that tends to be, it can be quite polluted, but at least it doesn't have human waste in it, usually, which sewage does. So sewage would be from pipes that come out of your homes, where what goes into the toilet ends up in the sewage, and shouldn't be in stormwater, although sometimes when there are leaky pipes or high water levels due to high rainfall, the sewage and stormwater mix together, the infrastructure is overloaded, and so sometimes the stormwater after a big rain event may have some sewage in it, and that's one of the reasons that people are advised not to swim after a big rain event, particularly if you're near a city. And then, factory waste. A lot of industrial processes generate a lot of waste that goes into drains and eventually through some treatment or not, and then into the ocean. So sewage is a really potent pollution mixture because of all the different things that are in it. So sewage has organic particles like feces, inorganic nutrients, which can be from the urine or released from the decomposing feces. If there's food that's washed down the drain, that includes organic particles, and that decomposes as well. There's also toxic chemicals from cleaning products, microbes from people's bodies that are in the sewage. So you've got a triple whammy of pollution because there are some things that can kill directly, like the toxic chemicals in the sewage and the germs in the sewage. Those can sicken and kill marine life and humans that are in contact with the sewage. And then there's the things that are indirectly harmful, like the organic waste. Even if it's non-toxic, when it sinks and rots, that decomposition process is an aerobic respiration process that uses up oxygen and depletes oxygen levels in the water. So where there's a lot of sewage, there's a lot of decomposition, and there's a big depletion of oxygen that can cause hypoxia and anoxia and some other benthic organisms. Also, as decomposition is happening, as the organic matter is breaking down, it's releasing inorganic nutrients like nitrates and phosphate and ammonia, and those inorganic nutrients can cause algae overgrowth, including harmful algae blooms like red tide. And all of that algae, as it decays and sinks to the bottom, it contributes to that over-enrichment of organic matter problem that leads to anoxia. It's interesting that if you sort of look at the way marine life, particularly sea bottom life, benthic life, changes as you go from an unimpacted area to an area near where there's a big sewage input, you see changes in the amounts of life, the types of life, and the overall diversity of life. So in this diagram here, you can see that sort of as you'd expect, right near the sewage outfall, conditions are pretty bad, and there's low biodiversity and low abundance of life other than microbes that are able to thrive in the anoxic environment that results from all the decomposition there. But a little bit further away from the sewage outfall, there may actually be some species that are increasing in abundance, perhaps some types of seaweed that grow really well in high nutrient concentrations, or scavengers and things like that. So some opportunists may be able to take advantage of that organic matter from the sewage. And then further away, you have a more stable environment where the biodiversity is higher again, and you have more species that are able to live if they're intolerant of the low oxygen levels and excessive organic matter and toxins associated with the sewage. So there are a lot of sad stories of environments that were really healthy and declined when human population in the area increased and sewage or other types of pollution mucked up the waters. But there are a handful now of happy stories where improved sewage treatment have restored nearshore environments near heavily populated areas. And Boston Harbor in the northeastern United States is one of those areas. So Boston Harbor was infamous for being extremely polluted. In fact, even though the city had a large waterfront, there were few homes or restaurants along the waterfront because it was such an unpleasant and actually dangerous place to be because of all the pollution in the water and the human pathogens from poorly treated wastes in the water. And The city invested, I think, over $1 billion in an improved sewage treatment system that used more stages of sewage treatment to remove more of the organic matter and nutrients from the effluent before releasing it. And they also moved the outfall, which is the pipe that the treated sewage comes out of, further offshore so that it wouldn't be collecting in the harbor and it would be dispersed further out on the continental shelf. And so this change, it didn't happen instantly, but relatively quickly over 5 to 10 years, greatly improved the water quality in Boston Harbor to the extent that the seagrass that they have there, Zostera marina, commonly called eelgrass, has been coming back. And this has not just been a good thing for seagrass, but it's also been a good thing for the economy of the waterfront in Boston. Now this is where the expensive restaurants and condos are. There are sailing lessons happening on the bay, and paddleboard races, and all kinds of the things that even non-scientists can appreciate about living on the waterfront. So I think this could be a lesson for other municipalities that have water pollution problems. A big investment in improving water quality can really pay off, not just environmentally, but economically as well. All right, so one of the problems that we have in areas like Southwest Florida, where we have a pollution problem that's not very well controlled, are an excess of nutrients getting into the water. And an excess of nutrients causes this process known as eutrophication. You can remember what eutrophication is because it rhymes with nutrification, and it means an excess of primary production resulting from an overabundance of nutrients. So primary producers like phytoplankton and seaweed become extremely abundant in these eutrophic conditions due to this sort of unlimited supply of nutrients. And then all of this biomass of algae and seaweed dies and decomposes, depleting oxygen and leaving these oxygen depleted zones called anoxic zones or dead zones. Another problem with eutrophication is that sometimes the algae are directly toxic. So it's not even just the fact that they're reducing oxygen, they're actually putting out toxins that can be harmful to human and animal health. There are many areas of the world's coast, particularly around big population centers like New York City, where there are chronic eutrophication problems. And you can see in this satellite photo an enormous area of green water off of the coast of New York and New Jersey, where the nutrient-enriched effluent from the New York and New Jersey area is contributing to this massive bloom. And this has been a problem that's been many, many years in the making as the watershed population has increased and more wastes have been getting into the water. Something that's making this problem worse is climate change, and what's making it worse is that when it's warmer, the organic matter decomposes faster, releasing more nutrients, so sewage is turning into algae fuel faster under warm conditions. And another thing that's happening is stratification, so the waters are less mixed, and the layering of the water can contribute to enhanced algae blooms. Also, the layering of the water can worsen the anoxic problem because it means that there's less turnover or less exchange between the surface waters and the bottom waters. So highly stratified waters don't mix as well, and so oxygen from the surface doesn't get down to the bottom in the stratified waters that form in a warm climate where the surface waters are much warmer than the deeper waters. One of the most famous dead zones in the world, if not the most famous dead zone in the world, is in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because there's a very, very large river that enters the Gulf of Mexico and has a correspondingly large watershed that covers much of the United States and much of the agricultural area and some big urban centers of the United States. And so there's a very large volume of water and a large volume of nutrients that are being injected into the Gulf of Mexico, and the amount of nutrients is even more than it was historically because there are man-made sources of nutrients like synthetic fertilizers and sewage that are entering into the river. And so this fuels these really, really large algae blooms that lead to a really large dead zone. The Mississippi River watershed is the biggest one in the United States and is a really dramatic example of how what happens on land affects the ocean. But every part of the land is a watershed. You're always in a watershed if you are on land. And that means that all the activities that humans do on land ultimately affect the ocean. And this is something that we should keep in mind. Even if we're far from the ocean, what we do to the land will eventually, because all water flows downhill through streams and rivers and groundwater, and to affect the ocean. So this map shows watersheds of Florida, and watersheds don't always obey state lines, and that's why some of the watersheds of Florida are overlapping into other states. The question I have here is, what sets the border between one watershed and another? You can see, I'll try to highlight one of the watersheds here. The watershed that is near, oops, let me get my pen for the highlighting. So this is the Caloosahatchee River, and the Caloosahatchee River watershed is this area here that drains into the Caloosahatchee River. And the Caloosahatchee River watershed has actually been modified a little bit from what you see in this picture, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so the border between one watershed and another would be a high point of land. So if you imagine, like, there's 3 mountains, let's make them snow-capped so you know that they're mountains. And let's say there's a river that flows through the valleys between them. So this would be a watershed, one watershed, and then this would be another watershed. Let's make the ocean here. And those are rivers going to the ocean. And so the boundary between one watershed and the other is the high points in the land. So the high points in the land are what sets the boundary between one watershed and another. And it's a little funny in Florida because it's kind of hard to see the high points in the land. Florida is very flat, and yet something that's just a little bit higher than the surrounding landscape can be one of these dividers between one watershed and another. And because Florida is so flat, we've really changed where the watershed boundaries are. Even just by simple things like building a road, it can cause water that used to flow from one area into another to flow in a completely different direction. So one example of watershed modification in Florida is the story of the Caloosahatchee River watershed. So the original Caloosahatchee River watershed is hashed in blue, and the current Caloosahatchee watershed is hashed in red, and so the overlapping area kind of looks purple in this diagram. So originally just the areas around the Caloosahatchee River form the Caloosahatchee River watershed. But the river was extended and linked to Lake Okeechobee so that it could be used as kind of a drain for Lake Okeechobee when water managers wanted to lower the level in Lake Okeechobee to protect croplands around the lake and things like that. So that basically, by connecting the Lake Okeechobee watershed to the Caloosahatchee River, greatly increased the size of the watershed. And so this is kind of like making a bigger funnel that all drains into the Caloosahatchee River and estuary now. So there's a larger volume of fresh water and also a larger amount of pollution that gets into the coastal waters of Lee County, Florida, due to this larger funnel that's now all, largely dumping into our poor little Caloosahatchee River and estuary. Let's talk about another type of pollutant, heavy metals. So heavy metals are elements like lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, and copper, which can be toxic to life. So the reason they're toxic to life is because they bond to organic molecules like the ones that we're made of, and they change the structure of those organic molecules. They cause them to fold and bend in different ways and stick to different things, and those effects make them quite toxic to life. So the sources of heavy metals, I mean, heavy metals are sort of part of the earth, but usually they're locked up in minerals and they're not really floating loose in the environment in forms that can harm living things. But some human activities like mining can release heavy metals into the environment. Mining and fossil fuel burning are some of the notorious things that release heavy metals, and there are other things as well. So runoff from industrial, urban areas tends to contain large amounts of heavy metals, and the aquatic ecosystems in those areas can easily be contaminated. Mercury is one of the most infamous heavy metals for marine pollution because it's quite common and quite harmful, and there's a lot of cases where marine organisms and even humans that have eaten seafood have been poisoned by mercury. So the form of mercury that's particularly bad is called methylmercury, because in that chemical compound where it's a methyl group attached to the mercury, it's more toxic in that form than in other forms. And one of the things that makes it toxic is that it builds up in the tissues of organisms. Methylmercury it likes to bond to other organic molecules, and it builds up in living tissues. And it also becomes more concentrated as you go up the food chain, and that process is called biomagnification. So due to that biomagnification process, something that's higher in the food chain will have a higher concentration of the toxin. So like a tuna would have a higher concentration of the toxin than an anchovy would, with the anchovy being lower on the food chain than the tuna. This is an animation that's going to show how bioaccumulation works. We're looking at a diatom, and this diatom, just as it's floating through its environment, if there are pollutants in the environment that bioaccumulate, they will stick to the biological structure of the organism, and over that organism's lifespan it will accumulate a lot of living things, sort of like if you had a sticky lollipop and it was on the rug, it would collect a lot of lint. That's sort of what it's like for a phytoplankton cell and methylmercury. Now, biomagnification is the related process where these small organisms that have just directly been picking up the pollutant from the water end up with a lot of pollutant in them. But then organisms higher in the food chain can pick up the pollutants directly from the water, but they also get a higher concentration of the pollutant from their diet, because everything that they eat has all of the pollutant that's been sticking to for its entire life. And this process becomes exponential with every step in the food chain, and because an organism has to eat 10 times its own mass to grow to a certain size, you're sort of taking a lot of pollution and concentrating it into a smaller volume of organism. And so as you go up the food chain, the pollutant levels get really high, till by the time you're at a top predator like a polar bear, there can be very high and harmful concentrations of the pollutant. There are some tragic examples of the bioaccumulation and biomagnification process of mercury pollution occurring in the world in areas that have affected human populations that lived in coastal areas and depended on the seafood. One of those examples is from Minamata, Japan, where there was a chemical factory that was releasing a lot of mercury pollution through poorly regulated waste management processes, and that pollution flowed through the watershed, got into the marine ecosystems, bioaccumulated in the lower levels of the food chain, and biomagnified up to the higher levels of the food chain, including the fish and shellfish that the people in that area ate. And people started getting sick, and the symptoms of methylmercury poison are really horrible for humans. There's muscle spasms, paralysis, there are mental effects, insanity. You might have heard of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, and the Mad Hatter was crazy because of mercury poisoning. That's something that happened to hat makers in the 19th century when they used mercury for one of the hat making processes and didn't realize for a while that that was what was causing the physical and mental health effects in the people that were exposed to the mercury. And then mercury poisoning is particularly harmful to developing fetuses, and so there are a lot of birth defects in the populations that were exposed to methylmercury. So finally, the Japanese people in this area sort of realized what was going on and held the chemical company accountable and closed it down. And the damage was done, but at least we can hopefully avoid this in the future. And this is just another example of the terrible birth defects that you can get from mercury exposure. Okay, let's talk about some of the qualitative pollutants, the things that are entirely man-made that constitute pollution in the environment. So there are many, many man-made chemical pollutants, but we'll talk about some of the most famous ones. 2 halogenated hydrocarbons, which means that they're hydrocarbons that have halogen elements like chlorine and bromine stuck to them. And having these halogens stuck to the hydrocarbons makes them last a lot longer in the environment than normal hydrocarbons because they can't be degraded easily by microbes. And that means that not only are they harmful, but they last for a long time in the environment, and then they can bioaccumulate and biomagnify for a long period of time. And they also have properties of sticking to organic matter, so they can really accumulate in living tissues and cause various toxic effects for a long period of time. DDT was one of these halogenated hydrocarbons that we initially thought was harmless because it didn't have any really obvious direct harmful effects on humans, and so we just thought it was sort of like the miracle chemical for as an insecticide, and we used it for mosquito control and for treating head lice like is happening in this picture. And there were trucks that would go down the street spraying this, and the kids would run out and play in the clouds that were following the truck and things like that. So we were really cavalier in our use of this chemical in the 1950s and 60s before scientists and environmental activists began to realize that it was causing harm. One of the most famous scientists and activists who recognized the harm and publicized it was Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson made the connection between DDT use and crashing bird populations, particularly predatory birds, were failing to reproduce because DDT, once biomagnified in the food chain and accumulated in predatory birds like an osprey or a bald eagle, it causes the eggshells to not form properly. So basically the birds lay scrambled eggs, and even if it doesn't kill the adult birds, those birds, by failing to reproduce, are failing to replenish their population and make up for the natural mortality, and therefore the bird populations of many species almost went extinct. It was a tragic situation where in the United States we almost lost our national bird, the bald eagle, due to DDT poisoning before Rachel Carson and her writing and advocacy of science helped us recognize this danger and ban DDT for use in the United States. Most countries have banned DDT, but it is used for mosquito control in some developing countries. There's a difficult balance in some cases between protecting human health by killing mosquitoes and protecting environmental health, and indirectly protecting human well-being by protecting the natural ecosystems that we depend on. So that's why there's some controversy about this. The thing is, if you use DDT for a long period of time in nature, the mosquitoes become immune to it anyways, so it's really not the best thing to use, even if you are trying to manage a difficult mosquito population. The one place where it might be okay to use it is in small-scale indoor use, but like I said, it's controversial. Another artificial biocide that is dangerous is polychlorinated biphenyls. So they're not actually designed to be insecticides or pesticides. They're used in a lot of man-made products like plastics, paint, and electrical equipment, but they have life-killing properties when they're released into the environment. They bioaccumulate in fat because of their nonpolar structure, and they cause all kinds of harmful biological effects, degrading the immune system, reproductive system, nervous system, hormone system, and they cause cancer. So pretty much any important system of the body, these things can really foul up. So some PCBs, we recognized the danger in the 1970s and banned them in 1979. The thing is, there are a lot of different variations on PCB structure. You could substitute one of the chlorines for another halogen, for example, and technically you'd have a different chemical that maybe wasn't illegal, but still had harmful effects. And so that's one of the struggles that we have with regulating these chemicals, is that the manufacturers can come up with just a slightly different variation on the chemical that's technically not illegal, but still has the harmful effects. And so even though many of the PCBs have been banned for a long time, they continue to bioaccumulate in marine food chains, especially due to the long food chains in the marine environment. And some marine populations, particularly top predators like orca whales, are really suffering to this day from high PCB concentrations, which oftentimes cause their young to be stillborn. And it's particularly tragic for these intelligent, long-lived animals with complex family structures. They actually grieve for their young, and this news story here is about a killer whale that continued to carry her stillborn calf around for weeks in Puget Sound after it was killed due to having a high, it died in the womb due to high PCB concentrations. All right, another type of human impact on the environment is ocean dredging and mining. So dredging is done regularly in coastal areas to dig the bottom deeper so bigger boats can get into an area. Obviously the water gets shallower as you get near shore, but in order to load a boat, you need to get the boat right up to shore. So we dig channels deeper so that big boats can get up near the shore. And then due to natural oceanographic processes, channels fill back in with sediment, and so we need to dredge and re-dredge. And there's a lot of harmful environmental impacts from constantly digging up the bottom and stirring up sediments like this. This picture here shows an example of a big dredging project in the port of Miami that sort of cuts through the Florida reef tract from the open waters of the Atlantic into the protected waters of Miami. And there are a lot of impacts to the corals and other organisms from the direct removal of sediment, where we're basically digging up the corals. Also, there are impacts in the areas where the sediment is dumped. Everything there gets buried in sediment, and the turbid waters, all the mud that's stirred up, drift around for a very long area. So there's sort of like a death cloud of mud that lasts for a very long time where the dredging activities are happening. The light is blocked, so photosynthetic organisms suffer, filter feeding organisms, including corals, are choked, and diseases can be spread as all of the microbes in the sediment are stirred up and the organisms are stressed by the sediment that's loaded on them. Also, if there's been pollution in the past that is accumulated in the sediments, during dredging activities, those pollutants from the past can be brought back up and re-injected into the water, giving them sort of a second round of killing. So dredging activities are really controversial and potentially quite dangerous for marine life. One thing that can sometimes be done to make good use of the dredged sediments is to re-nourish beaches with them. So if there's an area where the coastline is eroding, the sediments can be pumped up through giant tubes and squirted onto the beach. Sometimes this is done not on beaches, but to create these artificial islands called spoil islands, which can potentially be habitats for marsh plants or mangroves. But sometimes the sediment is too muddy, it has the wrong composition, or it's too polluted for it to be possible to do beach renourishment or other environmentally beneficial things with the sediment. Let's talk about one of the scariest worldwide effects of pollution, and that is man-made climate change. So there are multiple types of climate change. It's not always man-made, and the climate has changed a lot throughout history, but we're currently in an area where the most significant factor affecting the changing climate currently is this effect of man-made pollution, particularly greenhouse gas pollution, which I'll talk about later. So in this time series that goes from 10,000 years ago, or 12,000 years ago up to the present, you can see that our average temperature has been pretty steady until we got to about 150 years ago, and all of a sudden we had this major temperature spike that is projected to continue to increase due to greenhouse gas pollution. When we're talking about climate change, it's really important to distinguish the difference between weather and climate. So weather means specific conditions in the short term. So yesterday, today, tomorrow, next week, that's weather. And then climate is when you sort of integrate the weather across a longer period of time, looking at the general conditions across years, decades, centuries, millennia, even longer periods of time. And when you're looking at those typical conditions over a long period of time, you can look at the averages, average temperatures, for example, or the average rainfall. You can look at the extremes, so sort of the range of temperatures or other conditions that are experienced. And you can also look at the variability itself, like is the climate of this area steady, or does it vary a lot seasonally or day to day? Let's look at this time series graph of weather and climate from Tampa, Florida for the 2012 to 2013 season. And I can show some things on this graph that are examples of weather and some things that are examples of climate. So I'm going to get my pen tool out here. The red and green lines here are weather. So this is 2012 on this side of the graph, and this is 2013, starting in January 2013, and this vertical blue line is where it switches over. So to the left of the blue, to the right of the blue line, we're looking at 2012. To the left of the blue line, we're looking at 2013. That's just how you interpret this graph. So you can see that there is a lot of variation from day to day in the daily high, which is red, and the daily low, which is green. And you can look at that daily variation in relation to the normal high and the normal low, which is in blue. So those are the long-term average highs and the long-term average lows for that particular day of the year. So you can see, for example, in this day in April of 2012, the average high was a lot lower than normal and the average low was a lot lower than normal. Whereas on this day in 2012, the high was actually near record or record high. And another day like this one here, the actual high was just about average. So you can see that there's some times of the year, like the winter of 2013 had a lot of much hotter than normal weather, where both the daytime highs and the nighttime lows were higher than normal, whereas there were other periods of the year, like the fall of 2012, where there were some stretches of cooler than normal weather. And then another aspect of climate that is shown here, in addition to the typical high and typical low, is the record high and record low for each day. So you can see that in the summertime, there's not that much difference between the record highs and the record lows. It never gets that cold in the summer, or it never gets over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer in Tampa. Whereas if you're in the fall and winter, there's more span between the record highs and record lows, and there are some times in Tampa where the lows are actually below 0 degrees Celsius. So it does freeze in Tampa sometimes. That's just an example of how we can look at both the weather, which is the recent actual temperatures, and the climate, which is the sort of long-term averages and range of the temperatures. Another way that we look at weather and climate is by calculating temperature anomalies. So in order to calculate an anomaly, you need to have some long-term climate data, so you know what the typical average is, that long-term average. And then for the period that you're interested in examining, like today's temperature or this month's temperature, you can calculate the whether it's normal or anomalous, meaning abnormal, by taking that current temperature or the temperature of the period that you're interested in and subtract from it the average temperature for that period, and then you'll get the temperature anomaly, which can be a positive or a negative number. You get a positive temperature anomaly if it was warmer than the typical conditions for that time, and you get a negative temperature anomaly if it was cooler than normal for that time. So there are some great data resources on global temperature that you can look at the links below, and you can see for different regions of the world or for the world as a whole what the temperature anomaly was for a given period of time, and you can see how the temperature anomalies have changed over time. I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. This graph here shows annual global temperature anomalies calculated relative to the 1900 to 2000 AD mean. So the 20th century average temperature is what's sort of everything is adjusted to. So you can see that there was sort of this cool temperature anomaly. The years from 1880 to 1940 were sort of cooler than the average of the 20th century, but now we're into this period where the temperature anomalies are really consistently increasing, and things are getting a lot warmer than the typical conditions over the that we've had from recorded history. Before I talk about the ways that man-made pollution affects Earth's climate, I want to talk about some of the natural factors that can affect climate. Some people think that climate change is either totally natural or totally man-made, and it's actually both natural and man-made forces contribute to climate change. The natural forces have changed climate in some pretty dramatic ways over the long history of planet Earth, and scientists understand those natural causes quite well, and that's always sort of the background when we're looking at the man-made causes. Is first we have to account for all the natural causes, and then we can isolate and understand the man-made causes better. So some of the natural causes of climate change are celestial, so changes in the output of heat energy from the sun over millions and billions of years affect climate, and also changes in the orbit of the Earth and the timing of when the Earth is closer to the sun, at what season that occurs at, whether it's the northern hemisphere summer or winter. There's a lot of sort of long-term cycles in space that affect Earth's climate, and we don't have time to get deeply into that in this marine ecology course, but that is something that we understand pretty well, and we understand, for example, the role of some of these long-term celestial cycles in causing us to dip in and out of ice ages on a scale of 100,000 years or so. We also understand geological effects on climate change, so continental drift and uplift, volcanoes. Geological activity can cause changes in atmospheric chemistry, for example, that affect climate. And geological and oceanographic factors interact because the movement of the continents and changes in weather patterns affect ocean currents, which distribute heat around the Earth and affect climate in different ways. And then the living ecosystems of the Earth and the various chemical cycles associated with those living ecosystems also affect climate. For example, the biological cycling of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases can affect how much of those climate-influencing materials are in the atmosphere versus stored in biological materials or beneath the sediments of the Earth, affecting climate. So that last factor with these atmospheric chemicals that are involved in the cycles of life affecting climate is an important one, because that is the aspect of the Earth's climate systems that humans have been influencing the most. And the analogy that's typically used to describe this aspect of the climate system is the greenhouse effect. So to understand the greenhouse effect, let's first explain how an actual greenhouse works. So a greenhouse is a glass building that is used to create a warmer, a more humid environment for growing certain plants that like those conditions. And it doesn't have an artificial heater in it. It just works by trapping some of the heat energy from the sun. So sun rays shine in through the glass of the greenhouse as visible light, and then when those rays interact with the solid materials in the greenhouse, the dirt and the plants and things like that, they change to a different form of energy called infrared radiation. And that infrared radiation doesn't exit the greenhouse as easily as the visible light enters the greenhouse. So the light gets in, but then the form of energy changes to infrared radiation, and the infrared radiation does not escape so easily because it doesn't get through the glass that well. So basically the light energy gets in, but the heat energy doesn't get out. You've probably experienced the greenhouse effect if you ever got into a car that was parked in the sun, and it's much hotter inside the car than it is outside because the light energy entering the car is turning into heat energy inside the car, and the heat energy does not escape your car easily when the windows are closed. So the Earth's atmosphere can function somewhat like the glass of a greenhouse in that it's transparent to light energy, but it is not entirely transparent to heat energy. So some heat energy radiating off of the surface of the Earth goes back into outer space. And that's why the temperature of the Earth doesn't constantly increase. But some of the heat energy that's radiating towards space ends up getting reflected back towards Earth. And the greater the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is, the greater percentage of the infrared energy gets reflected back into Earth. So it's sort of like the Earth is putting on a thicker blanket, and even though the total amount of energy coming into the system is not increasing, more of that heat energy is staying within the atmosphere and the Earth is heating up. All right, so how does this relate to humans? Anthropogenic means caused by humans, and so anthropogenic climate change is attributable to pollutants in the air that increase the greenhouse effect above natural levels. So it's sort of like we're adding more glass panels to the greenhouse that is the Earth. So there's a couple important things to note about this greenhouse effect. The first is, what are those things, the greenhouse gases, that are functioning like additional glass panels on the greenhouse? So major ones which occur naturally at some concentration but may be increased by human activities include water vapor, which is a very important greenhouse gas that occurs naturally in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and methane. So water vapor is interesting because it is a powerful greenhouse gas, but if there's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, it also increases cloud formation, which has a cooling effect on the climate because it causes the incoming light energy to reflect back into space. So increasing water vapor doesn't really affect the warming in the same way that increasing the other greenhouse gases does. So that's why I have carbon dioxide and methane in red. So they are very significant greenhouse gases, which both of them have increased a lot due to human pollution. So a little bit of greenhouse gas effect, the natural amount that are caused by that's caused by the natural abundances of these things, is actually good because it keeps the Earth warm enough to be habitable and not icy. But it's just, as we're adding more unnatural amounts of these carbon dioxide and methane greenhouse gases, we're ramping up the greenhouse effect to levels that are harmful, making it too hot to be suitable for, or too hot to be optimal for life. So the increases in concentrations of these greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, are really, really obvious in the data that we've been collecting on these concentrations for a long period of time. So since the 1950s to the present, there's been an observatory on the top of Mauna Loa, this big volcano in Hawaii, that sticks high into the atmosphere in an isolated part of the Pacific Ocean, and is a really good place to measure like typical concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what we've seen is that there's this sort of sawtooth pattern because due to seasonal cycles, there's up and down in carbon dioxide every year. But underneath that yearly up and down, there's this long-term trend, really increasing trend of higher and higher carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So we've gone from, and we have other records of carbon dioxide that go further back in time and show us that before the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per billion. And, oh, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. This should be parts per million, not parts per billion. I forgot to fix that. Parts per million. All right, so 280 parts per million was sort of the natural level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in modern times, and it has gone up a lot due to this carbon dioxide pollution to the present day when I think the most recent measurement was 416 parts per million. So that's a lot, and this big increase is most dramatic if you view it in context of the last 10,000 years or longer period of atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So this is the same data, but now instead of looking just at the last 60 years, we're going back 10,000 years. So if you go back 10,000 years, there have been pretty low concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, for the most part, around 280 parts per billion. And this you can see how unnatural this recent increase is. And we can also see, if we look even further back in time to almost 1 million years, if we look back 800,000 years, then we're now looking back in time through several glacial, interglacial cycles. Like this was the last ice age here, this was the last break between ice ages, this was the previous ice age, and you can see that there's these cycles of warm and cold temperature that are related to these astronomical effects. But never, even in those phases of going in and out of global ice ages, have we ever reached the current levels of really high atmospheric CO2. So we're creating this composition of the atmosphere that hasn't been seen in 1 million years on the Earth, and it's likely that that's going to have very significant effects on the climate. In fact, we're seeing some of those big effects on the climate already. So why is carbon dioxide increasing so fast? These are the two main human activities that are leading to this big spike in modern times. Number one is burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are things like oil, coal, and natural gas that are remains of living things that have been buried in the ground for a very long time. When we dig them out of the ground and burn them, the carbon that's in those living things interacts with oxygen in the atmosphere and becomes CO2 in the atmosphere, increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And deforestation also increases the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because forests have a lot of carbon stored in the plants and the soil, and when we cut down the forests and burn the forests, that carbon through decomposition and burning ends up turning into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't all stay in the atmosphere. Some of it ends up going into the ocean, and that affects ocean chemistry in interesting ways that we'll talk about. All right, so let's summarize what we know about anthropogenic climate change. We know that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the ocean are increasing fast, and we know that we're the cause of the increase. There's no natural explanation for the skyrocketing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation perfectly explain that huge increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. We also know that the increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is enhancing the greenhouse effect, because we know carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and we understand the influence that it has on the atmosphere's retention of heat. So we know that the temperature of the Earth is rising as a result of this increased CO2 concentration, and that effect is getting worse as the CO2 concentration increases. And we also know that because the ocean and atmosphere are in equilibrium, or will tend towards equilibrium with respect to carbon dioxide concentrations, that the more CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, the more CO2 is increasing in the ocean, and that is making the ocean more acidic. because carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, and that effect is getting worse. There are some things that we don't know for sure about climate change. For example, we're not certain exactly how much warmer it's going to get. We don't know exactly how fast the warming is going to occur, although we can observe how fast it's been occurring so far. We don't know exactly how much sea level rise will rise, or exactly how ecosystems will respond, or exactly how human society will be affected by the climate changes and ripple effects through the Earth's ecosystems. But even though we don't know those things exactly, we have lots of data and we can make good predictions on each of those things. And the more data we get and the further we progress into the future and can sort of test the predictions that we made in the past, the better our predictions become, and we get more zeroed into what's really going to happen. So even though we don't know those things for sure, we have a pretty good idea, and we know that climate change is a major threat that we need to mitigate if possible. So these are some of the effects that we expect from the increasing atmospheric CO2, which is the driver of change in this system. So increasing atmospheric CO2 through the greenhouse gas effect is increasing air temperature due to the atmosphere is retaining more heat. The increased temperature of the air and land also increases the temperature of the ocean. Increased air temperature also changes weather patterns, so we call that climate change. That can alter the frequency of storms. It can create more desert areas on land and stronger winds that increase iron fertilization of the ocean as more terrestrial dust containing iron is blown into the ocean. That can stimulate algal blooms. The altered storm frequency can create more storm surges on shore. Increased air temperature and increased water temperature also leads to sea level rise because warmer water expands. Also, sea ice melts, and that leads to increase in sea level rise. And so higher sea level plus more storms is a bad combination that can lead to coastal flooding and erosion. The increase in sea surface temperature can change sort of what types of life are able to live in what parts of the ocean, and it also changes the thermohaline circulation, which is sort of the temperature and salinity driven circulation patterns of the ocean, which can have big ripple effects throughout ocean ecosystems. And so those are all of the changes that are ultimately related to the greenhouse gas effect on air temperature. Another type of change that we're getting from this increased atmospheric CO2, though, is the effect of carbon dioxide in the water. So carbon dioxide in the water creates carbonic acid that reduces the concentration of carbonate and acidifies the water and creates harmful effects for marine organisms that need a higher pH environment to survive. So one of the complications of climate change is that it's not just a uniform warming. It's the warming will vary from place to place, and there will be other changes in climate, like as temperature changes, so do rainfall and snowfall patterns, wind patterns, ocean currents change, and the frequency of extreme weather and the periodicity of cycles like El Nino also changes as the climate changes. So that's why we say global climate change instead of just global warming, which is what they originally called it, because there will be many changes besides just the temperature increasing on average. One of these details of climate change that is pretty significant is the pattern of what parts of the Earth are warming the fastest. So the poles of the Earth, the high latitude areas represented at the top here and the bottom here of the graph, they are changing in temperature faster than the temperate and equatorial regions are. So the overall Earth is getting warmer. So it is getting warmer everywhere, but the fastest increase in temperature is happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic environment. One of the consequences consequences of the fact that the Arctic and the Antarctic are warming faster than the low latitude areas are warming is that it's melting glaciers. So melting glaciers and continental ice sheets like the one in Greenland and the one in Antarctica, that contributes to sea level rise and flooding the world's coast and low-lying islands. The other contributor to sea level rise, of course, is thermal expansion of seawater. So even if there's no ice melting, just the water expanding because it's warmer also raises sea level. And then the fact that the poles are warming faster than the equator means that we're going into this situation where there's less difference in temperature between the poles and the equator, and that means that weather patterns really change. For example, the Gulf, not the Gulf Stream, but the jet stream is relatively steady when there's a strong temperature gradient from low to high latitudes, but when there's less of a temperature gradient from low to high latitudes, the jet stream can meander more, and that ironically can mean that you get more, not only more warm fronts reaching high latitudes, but also more cold fronts reaching low latitudes. All right, let's talk about sea level rise. The rate of sea level rise for the past couple thousand years was very slow on average, like less than a millimeter per year. But since we've entered this era of increased global temperatures due to man-made effects, that rate of sea level rise has increased from less than 1 millimeter per year to about 3.5 millimeters per year at present. And the slope of this graph is actually increasing. So there's a lower slope here, higher slope here, and then we're reaching an even higher slope now. So the rate of sea level rise is accelerating, which means that the amount that sea level rises per year is going up. So it might have risen might be rising 3.5 millimeters per year now, but soon it may be rising 6 millimeters per year, and that's a major concern because the faster sea level is rising, the harder it is for both humans and natural ecosystems to adapt to that rising sea level. So we can project this accelerated sea level rise into the future and predict what the sea levels are going to be like at the end of the 21st century in the year 2100. And most of the models are predicting about a 1 meter rise in sea level. Although there is some variation, with some predicting almost 2 meters and others predicting less. As the models are updated and as we get further along into the year 2020, it's looking like we're on track for the mid or high levels of sea level rise, which is quite a bit of sea level rise. So just to review the causes of sea level change, the two that are related to man-made climate change are number 1 and number 2 here. There's the thermal expansion effect, which is basically just the fact that when water is warmer, it expands and takes up more space, and sort of you can see it overflowing its banks here as the oceans expand. And the other is that continental ice sheets, where a lot of the world's water is stored, are melting and pouring into the ocean, and so the melting of ice sheets fills up the ocean as the ice sheets melt. So both of these effects are combining due to man-made climate change and affecting the sea level. There are some other things that affect sea level on much longer timescales, natural effects on sea level related to continental drift, but those things are such long-term processes that they're not really relevant at the scales of human civilization. All right, so what happens to the man-made structures and coastal and natural coastal ecosystems as sea level changes? Well, there are certainly times in the past, not even that long ago, as we came out of the last ice age, that sea level rose a lot. And coastal ecosystems can shift and adapt to some extent. So the ways that natural ecosystems adapt to a rising sea include biogenic sediment accretion. So some habitats like coral reefs build themselves up, and if their rate of buildup by creating new calcium carbonate exceeds the rate of sea level rise, then they can stay near the surface and maintain themselves as sea level rises. Another type of habitat that accretes would be like a salt marsh. So salt marsh grasses trap sediments, and sediments layer on top of each other, and this can elevate the surface of the marsh and help sort of keep the marsh in place as the sea level is rising, as long as it's not exceeding the rate of sediment accretion. And the other thing that can happen is that the habitats, the front of the habitat might be retreating, but the habitat can also move further inland. So the overall amount of habitat sort of remains, it just shifts from it was over here and now it's over here. So if we give a place for natural ecosystems to retreat, we might be able to keep the same amount of natural ecosystems. The thing is, humans have built a lot of structures on the land, and we don't want to give up those structures. So we're sort of in the way of that natural retreat of the ecosystem. So what really happens is that the sea level basically eats away the natural ecosystems and then hits the barriers that humans have put up there, unless we give some room for the natural ecosystems to shift in. And if that were the case, we'd probably need to shift our own habitations further inland as well. So that relates to the strategies that we have to deal with sea level rise if it's too late to prevent it. And it's not too late to reduce climate change, but even with just the amount of pollution that we've put into the atmosphere already, we're sort of already in for a good bit of climate change and sea level rise, even if we were somehow able to totally stop pollution now. So it doesn't mean that like, oh, well, we're doomed and we might as well not do anything because there's going to be climate change anyways. It means that there's going to be some climate change, but anything that we can do to reduce the amount of climate change will help a lot. Anyways, so for the climate change that's going to happen, there are three main strategies for dealing with it. There's accommodation, protection, and retreat. So accommodation means you sort of let the sea come to you, and you raise buildings and roads, like you can put a house up on stilts, so the water can come under the house. That may work better in some areas than other areas. You can create drainage systems to help the water drain back into the sea after a high tide more easily. So places like Miami and the Keys, for example, are trying to do accommodation to deal with sea level rise to some extent. There's also protection. That's like seawalls, breakwaters, and dikes. That's what places like the city of New Orleans have done, where the area is below sea level, but there are barriers to keep the sea out and pump the water out. The thing about protection strategies is they're very expensive, and they tend to be very disruptive to habitats because they prevent the sort of landward retreat of coastal habitats like mangroves and salt marshes. And then the final strategy is retreat. So you move your house from the coast further inland and further uphill, and that is probably one of the better strategies for dealing with climate change, because it gives a place for nature to move up as well. All right, let's talk about some of the effects of climate change, particularly the temperature increases on marine ecosystems. So there are three main ways that I want you to know that marine ecosystems and organisms can be influenced by temperature increases. So the first thing is kind of a direct effect of temperature increase. So organisms are all evolved to live within a certain range of temperature. The chemicals that make up their bodies work best in a certain range of temperature, and their metabolic processes are thrown off if the temperature is above or below their optimal range. So that direct change in temperature can potentially kill organisms, and with one organism gone, the other organisms in the food web even if they weren't directly affected by those temperature changes, they can be affected by the ripple effect of no longer having that organism that used to be there that got killed by the high temperatures. Or uh, con conversely, the food web can be affected if there's an organism that likes warm weather that wasn't in that area before, that moves in, and that could also disrupt the food web connections in the area. So sometimes the adults of an organism are relatively tolerant to ups and downs in temperature, but the spawning processes, the eggs, and the babies of the organisms tend to be more sensitive to temperature changes. So sometimes that's the way that temperature ends up really harming organisms. For example, sea turtle sex ratios are determined in part by the temperature of the sand where the eggs are laid, and warmer temperatures can distort the sex ratio in ways that might be harmful to the sustainability of the sea turtle populations. Another example of how things are affected by temperature changes is species range shifts. So species that were found in cool areas may experience habitat range contractions. Basically, there's less cool areas than there used to be, so their range is shrinking, whereas species that are found in warm tropical habitats might actually be expanding their range. And that is something that we're seeing in a lot of areas of the world where there is a salt marsh to mangrove transition. So mangroves dominate in tropical habitats and salt marshes in temperate habitats. And as the climate warms, mangroves are moving into salt marshes, and particularly in places like the northern Gulf of Mexico that are dominated by salt marshes now, we are seeing more and more mangroves move into those habitats. Mangroves provide many of the same ecosystem functions as salt marshes, but they don't support all of the same species, and it really is changing the habitat in ways that aren't all good. So this is something that we need to be aware of as it's happening. Another way that temperature affects marine ecosystems is by favoring the growth and reproduction of decomposers and pathogens. Pathogens are germs, and so decomposers and pathogens grow faster in warmer water. That means that diseases caused by those germs increase in warmer water. Organisms that are stressed by warm water, like corals, can then be infected by those diseases, and that's what's happening to this coral here. This part is dead, and this black part here is where there's a disease that is progressing across the coral and killing it. So the coral is stressed by the warm temperature, and then the disease is favored by the warm temperature, and it's really a disaster for killing that coral. Organisms that are held in aquaculture settings are also vulnerable to these effects of increased growth of pathogens and decomposers in warmer water. So the faster growth of decomposers and other heterotrophic microbes in aquaculture settings means that hypoxia and anoxia tend to develop faster in these waters. Also, warmer waters don't hold oxygen as well, so warm waters tend to worsen low oxygen and no oxygen problems in aquaculture settings, as well as in the natural environment, and also increase the infection rates in those environments. Then there's some algae, both phytoplankton and benthic algae living on the bottom, that grow faster when it's warm. So this is another factor, in addition to higher nutrient concentrations, that can contribute to increased amounts of harmful algae blooms as the climate warms. So one of the biggest and most globally influential effects of climate change on the ocean, potentially, it will be the changes in ocean current patterns. So there's two main types of ocean currents. There are wind-driven currents, which are also known as geostrophic currents, and they're sort of driven by the global wind patterns, like the trade winds in the low latitudes, the westerlies in the mid latitudes, the easterlies in the polar latitudes. And as the wind patterns change, so the current patterns change, and that means that the delivery of different water masses to different parts of the world and the temperature regulation effects that are provided by those big currents change as the current patterns change. The other type of currents is density-driven currents, currents driven by rising and falling waters due to the water being more dense because it's cold and salty, or less dense because it's warm and or fresh. Those density-driven currents, which are really important in sort of the overturning circulation of the ocean, those can change if the processes that affect water density, like evaporation, precipitation, and warming and ice melting, as those processes that affect density change, the density-driven current patterns change, and that could actually weaken and shut down some of those overturning currents, which could be quite bad. So that could result in the deep oceans no longer being refreshed by surface waters, and low oxygen problems developing in the deep oceans. And also, particularly with those changes in wind-driven current patterns, heat might not be distributed around the world as well. So some parts of the world, like Northern Europe, could actually get colder as the climate warms. Those changes in the global ocean circulation patterns, particularly in the density-driven currents, are shown in this simplified diagram here, which shows a very simplified schematic of sort of what they call the global ocean conveyor belt, the large-scale pattern of where surface waters of the ocean tend to cool and sink, which one of the major spots of that in the world is the North Atlantic. And there's other spots in the world where deep waters rise to the surface through upwelling. The North Atlantic is an area where salty surface waters brought up by the Gulf Stream and other northward surface currents tend to cool in the cold Arctic air and become dense enough to sink to the bottom, and that sort of brings surface waters into the ocean and refreshes the deep ocean and refreshes the deep ocean waters with oxygen. The thing is, if there's a lot of ice melting off the land in Greenland, then that will make the water fresher in the North Atlantic, and fresher water is less dense and it might not sink as well, and we predict that that could really weaken the creation of North Atlantic deep water, and that would result in major shifts in the properties of the water in the deep ocean, and also in climate, like it might reduce the flow of warm water northward and alter the climate of Europe, making it cold in northern Europe. Some of the most significant parts of the marine environment when it comes to climate change are the parts of the marine environment that are seasonally covered in ice. So the Arctic Ocean and the Antarctic Ocean that have seasonal and permanent sea ice are really susceptible to climate change. So sea ice is the layer of ice that's floating on the ocean. It's usually from 1 to 2 meters thick. And the extent of it is shrinking, as you can see in the difference between the yellow line, which is typical sea ice extent, to the amount of sea ice that there was in the year that this picture was taken, which is in white, which is a much lesser extent. So the extent of coverage is shrinking, and also the thickness of the ice is getting less as there's less multi-year ice, and the ice that is there tends to be more recently formed ice. So this affects animals that depend on the sea ice habitat, like polar bears and seals. And it also affects the marine food chains that form under the ice and around the ice edges by sort of changing the seasonal pattern of primary productivity and having these effects that sort of ripple through the food chain. The decline in Arctic sea ice is really dramatic when we look at the Arctic sea ice anomaly in this picture. So this is for every point in time we're looking at the actual amount of sea ice adjusted relative to the long-term average amount of sea ice for that area. And this is from satellite data. So this goes from 1979, the year that I was born, until the present. And you can see there's been, a really significant drop in the amount of sea ice. So this is tragedy for the organisms that are dependent on the sea ice habitats, such as polar bears, they have to make longer swims from one ice-covered area to the next as the ice becomes patchier and less abundant. Sometimes the adult polar bears may be able to make the swim, but the cubs, which are less insulated and have less energy reserves, will not be able to make the swim, and they'll drown and die in the ocean. One of the interesting ways that this part of the marine environment, the Arctic and Antarctic sea ice habitats, interacts with climate is an example of what we call a positive feedback. So positive feedback is where there's a process that reinforces itself and can lead to sort of a runaway worsening. So the term positive feedback can actually be a little bit misleading because positive feedbacks are not necessarily good things. Positive feedback just means a self-reinforcing process, but it might actually be a harmful process that's reinforcing itself. We'd still call it a positive feedback. And so the positive feedback with Arctic sea ice is white and it reflects a lot of sunlight back into space. Whereas water is dark colored and it absorbs more light energy as heat. So if a lot of the ocean is covered in ice, then a lot of the heat is reflected back into space, and that contributes to keeping things cool. But the opposite happens when more of the dark seawater, liquid seawater, is exposed. That means that the seawater is absorbing more heat and in turn melting more ice, and in turn absorbing more heat and in turn melting more ice, and so on in a positive feedback cycle. So these positive feedback cycles with sea ice are represented in this diagram here, where if things are warming, that leads to less sea ice, which means more solar radiation is absorbed, which means more warming, which leads to less sea ice, and you get this positive feedback cycle going that way. The positive aspect of this is if we could somehow reverse the trend and start cooling the climate again, then that would cause more sea ice to grow, which would cause more solar radiation to be reflected, which would cause more cooling. And so if we could reverse the trend, then we might get some help from nature in the positive feedback going the other way to cool things off. There's another major positive feedback in the ocean environment that we talked about earlier in the coast, and I'll put that one up on the slide here too. That other positive feedback is when warming temperatures in the deep sea destabilize methane hydrate deposits beneath the sea floor, releasing methane gas, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So with that methane from the seafloor being released into the atmosphere, that would contribute to warming the atmosphere, which would in turn warm the deep ocean, which would in turn release more methane, and again you have another one of these positive feedback cycles. So it's pretty worrisome. A lot of scientists are really concerned that we may already be near a so-called tipping point, where once these positive feedback cycles start really strongly reinforcing themselves, then even when humans mitigate their own influences on the climate, the cycle may have already started to the point that it's not going to quit until we get a lot of climate change. One of the reasons that we're concerned about this climate change is because of how dramatically it can affect marine ecosystems through some of the direct and indirect measures that we've mentioned. So one of the things that we learned about earlier in the course in the primary productivity lecture was how seasonal cycles in phytoplankton productivity and in turn zooplankton productivity and in turn productivity at higher levels in the food chain, they're really related to cycles of warming and cooling on a seasonal basis. And as those seasonal cycles shift in their timing, then some of the sort of reliable spring blooms of phytoplankton, for example, that support the food chain that ultimately leads to seabirds, those break down. And that can mean that these valued higher organisms in the food chain are suffering for lack of a food source. And one of the reasons that changes in seasonal patterns and warming might decrease phytoplankton productivity is due to an increased period of stratification in the summertime, where there is warmer water on top of cooler water, and the cool water is where the nutrients are. And so if the water is really stratified, then the surface waters are not getting the nutrients they need from the deeper waters, and therefore there won't be very much phytoplankton growing in those warm, excessively warm and isolated surface waters. All right, let's talk not so much about the temperature effect now, but the chemical effect of this carbon dioxide pollutant from the atmosphere, which gets into the ocean. So that is ocean acidification. So the key reaction here is carbon dioxide plus H2O. Those two combine to form H2CO3, which we call carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then releases its H plus ions into the water, which makes it more acidic and lowers the pH. And this lowered pH environment of the ocean is disruptive to many marine species, and that has ripple effects throughout food chains and habitats. So on this left side of the diagram here, we see sort of that negative scenario where there's a lot of carbon dioxide pollution entering the ocean, becoming carbonic acid, and reducing the availability of carbonate for the formation of reefs and causing more degradation of the reef framework. So you can see there's cracks in the reef here that are happening as the acidic environment weakens the calcium carbonate structure. In this alternative situation here, where we're doing environmentally friendly things that reduce the amount of CO2 pollution, we are able to preserve our rich coral reef environment, and that's really what we want to go for, obviously. So the negative effects of carbon dioxide on coral reefs manifest in different ways. One of them is decreased calcification rates, which means that the corals are not able to form their calcium carbonate skeleton as fast, so they're not able to grow as fast. And so this diagram here shows reduced calcification rates predicted as time goes on, and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere increase. So reduced calcification rates are interacting with increased bioerosion rates. So bioeroding organisms like this red boring sponge, Cleona deletrix, they can actually break down the rock of the coral faster when the ocean is more acidic. So it's really a big problem that the corals are not growing as fast, and the rock is being broken down faster by these bioeroding organisms like the sponges. So the reefs are no longer able to have a favorable balance of growth versus decay, and they're basically dissolving away. And you can even see that, like in this picture from the Florida Keys, the rock of the reef is literally dissolving away before our eyes. Okay, we're done talking about global warming, but I want to talk about another atmospheric pollution problem that is not related to global warming, because this is something that a lot of people confuse with global warming. So it's the destruction of the ozone layer. Destruction of the ozone layer is a big atmospheric pollution problem, but it's not related to global warming. And I want you, as graduates of this marine ecology course, to know the difference. Both of these things are problems, but they're different problems that shouldn't be confused in your minds. Okay, so the ozone layer is a thin layer of O3 gas, which we call ozone, which is high in the atmosphere. And so it's transparent to most wavelengths of light, like the visible light that we see, but it's not transparent to UVB ultraviolet radiation. It blocks a lot of the UVB radiation from getting to the surface of the Earth. And that's really significant for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, because UVB radiation causes disruptions to DNA that can cause cancer. So it can cause skin damage as well, and it can decrease the primary productivity of plants and phytoplankton, and cause animals to get cancer and things like that. So we really don't want a bunch of UVB radiation getting into the Earth. So thank goodness for the ozone layer. The problem is that there are certain man-made chemicals that persist in the environment for a very long time and drift high into the atmosphere and undergo a complex reaction that breaks down the O3 molecules into O2 molecules. And as long as those chemicals are up there in the atmosphere, they continue to destroy O3 molecules. And these chemicals, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, last for a very long time. They last for such a long time that they can accumulate in parts of the earth that are actually far, far from the areas where the chemicals were produced. And these pollutants, man-made pollutants, actually, ironically, have been accumulating in the atmosphere over Antarctica, which is one of the areas that's, of course, furthest from human activity, but just due to global atmospheric circulation patterns, that's where the pollutants accumulate. And that's where a major hole or thin area of the ozone layer has developed over Antarctica. So the positive thing about this ozone story is that we recognized pretty early on what chemicals it was that were causing the destruction of the ozone layer. And when we recognized that these chemicals were destroying the ozone layer in the 1980s, we actually came up with an international ban on these CFC chemicals in 1989. And so we banned the chemicals in 1989. The amount of ozone continued to decrease for a while because of sort of the lasting effects of those chemicals. But from the 90s to the present, we've sort of stopped the destruction of the ozone layer, and it looks like ozone might be increasing a little bit again. So it's just sort of a good reminder that if we get together as an international community, recognize what pollutants are causing the harm, and ban them, then we can reverse the decline and begin a recovery of the Earth's ocean atmosphere systems. So that's great for the ozone, but hopefully we'll apply this model of international collaboration on reducing harmful pollutants to other pollutants like carbon dioxide, which causes this other problem known as global warming, not related to the ozone layer, but another atmospheric problem that we need to deal with. All right, to summarize what we know about these global ocean pollution problems and what we should do about them. We know that these global pollution and climate change problems that result from pollution are real, and they're getting worse. And nowhere on Earth is immune from the harmful effects. For example, plastic reaches even the most distant shores of the most isolated islands in the sea, and the entire Earth is subject to climate change from carbon dioxide and methane pollution. And these effects are putting human health and well-being at risk. And so we really need to work together to live sustainably in a way that's not causing a buildup of harmful pollution. So we can do that on a per-person basis by conserving, by being green, meaning each person produce less pollution. And we also need to address the total number of people because the amount of pollution is the product of the amount that each person pollutes multiplied by the number of people that there are in the world. So we need to stabilize the population level of the Earth so that the number of people on Earth is not ever increasing. So that means balancing the birth rate and the death rate so that we're at a steady population level.